Hello, welcome everyone, and thank you so much for coming. I know it's been a very long 2 weeks for a lot of you, so we appreciate your attention and your presence. I'd also like to thank our panelists, all of our panelists for contributing today, and to everybody who's also attending online. My name is Gaya Sriskanthan, and I'm with the International Climate Justice Program of Rosa-Luxemburg-Stiftung, based in New York. And we're here today to discuss the Bridgetown Initiative. We want to see action on climate, and for developing countries, that means access to finance. And as we come to the tail end of these negotiations, finance has become a hot-button issue. Addressing those finance needs in the midst of a growing post-pandemic debt crisis raises the stakes, and it also narrows the options that developing countries have to pursue meaningful climate action and their ability to recover socially, politically, and economically from climate disasters, which creates a vicious cycle. So what we would like to discuss today is how we deal with this reality in the context of the current global financial system. Last year, under the leadership of Barbados, the Bridgetown Initiative was put forward as a proposal to deal with some of the currently intractable problems that developing countries face, balancing their debt payments with climate impacts, and addressing major climate financing gaps that have been referenced almost daily in these rooms and these halls. So today we will get a chance to discuss the Bridgetown Initiative, whether and how it has the potential to address some of these issues, as well as consider complementary or different approaches to financial system reform that may be necessary to address the mounting contradictions between the need for climate ambition and the economic difficulties, plus the lack of access to finance being faced by many countries in the global south. We have an incredible panel of speakers to guide us through this inquiry today. Firstly, I'm very pleased to introduce Mr. Ricardo Marshall, who is the director of the Roof to Reefs program in the Prime Minister's Office of the Government of Barbados. We also have Bodo Ellmers, who is the director of Financing for Sustainable Development program at the Global Policy Forum, based in Berlin. We also have Emilia Reyes from Equidad de Género, Ciudadanía, Trabajo y Familia, based in Mexico, and Tetet Lauron from the Rosa-Luxemburg-Stiftung, based in Manila, and lastly, but not least, Adrián Martínez Blanco from La Ruta del Clima, based in Costa Rica. We will also have the chance to hear comments and questions from all of you in the audience at the end. And also, if you're online, please do post your questions in the chat, and we'll be monitoring that and picking up your questions at the end of the session. So we will kick off today's program with a contribution from Ricardo Marshall from the government of Barbados. Ricardo, we're so grateful to have you here today and for the leadership of Barbados in trying to address some of the most difficult and critical issues facing debt-burdened global south countries today. We'd be grateful if you could open this session with an overview of the Bridgetown Initiative and how it seeks to address the seemingly intractable problems that I outlined in the introduction.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon to all here, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and good night to those who may be online. For us, the Bridgetown Initiative had its genesis in what we saw as a need to change the way in which we were thinking about not just climate finance, but development finance and development-related matters. The Prime Minister challenged her team to come back with something that could bring change and could spark discussion. And I think we're well on the way in that respect. For many of us, we see it as an opportunity to change a global financial architecture that was designed at a time when many of the countries represented in this room today did not exist. So the Bretton Woods institutions have had their time under that format, but especially facing the seminal crisis of our time in the climate crisis, we feel that its current format does not allow us to address the needs and concerns of the vast majority of countries and people on this planet. You can see the wording of Bridgetown 2.0 behind me, but I want to speak to you at a much more specific and personal level. We can divide climate into three broad areas: mitigation, adaptation, and loss and damage. There are lots of other issues that we need to deal with, including just transition, including response measures, etc. But all of those can be addressed when we address mitigation, adaptation, and loss and damage. We have failed collectively to mitigate. There's no doubt about that. We're not in any way right now holding to the 1.5 that is so important to those of us in AOSIS. We're barreling well beyond 2, in the region of 2.7 right now, whether we like it or not. So the first issue is to address mitigation. How do you finance mitigation? Because at the end of the day, finance is the thread that binds all of this together. And it is our failure to mitigate that has us where we are right now. Mitigation can happen anywhere in the world. But we all know which countries have historically had the largest contribution. That is a reality and a fact. But the other reality is that mitigation projects oftentimes have a revenue stream that can be attached to it. And so the private sector is interested in mitigation-related projects. But they're interested in projects. You do not have a project until you have done the feasibility, you've done the initial design, you've done the EIAs, you've done the revision of that design, and gone through a planning process. And that takes money. And so you've got to be able to finance that first part, whether or not you're asking countries or companies to finance the feasibility component themselves, or if you're looking at grant opportunities there. But once you have a project, you can then look at financing it, and you can integrate into the project a financial model that allows you to pay back for the feasibility. But not all of your projects will be feasible. So you have to address that. Adaptation occurs at the national level, however, and it is guided by what you see as your national priorities. It is not the job of any other entity to come and tell you what your priorities should be or what your adaptation activities would be. But the issue is that that adaptation costs a significant sum of money, and unfortunately, it's never sexy. So it doesn't attract the level of funding that we're talking about. Bridgetown identifies ways in which you can address attracting more grants for that sort of activity, but also in understanding the fact that we need to address resilience and adaptation for us. And so the answer is you also need to have the opportunity to have more concessional finance available. You need to have the fiscal space to be able to do so, and you need to be paying back at a rate that puts you on a level playing field. There are a number of countries represented by persons in this room who will borrow money at 1.5 or 2, maybe 4%, over a 35-year period with a 10-year moratorium on repayment. That doesn't happen for the majority of us in the developing world. We're going to the same or similar institutions, and we're being offered loans at 9 and 10 and 12 and 14%. And when it goes to the private sector, add another 2% onto that. And so it is not a level playing field. We need to be able to access greater concessional resources at those sorts of interest rates that give us that fiscal space to be able to respond. And so that is why you will see outlined in Bridgetown, how can you get greater access by the MDBs and the AFIs to financing to allow them to bring in additional investment, including private sector resources, to be able to make that greater amount of concessional financing available to us. Which brings us to loss and damage. Loss and damage, we're not detailing exactly how we're going to treat to that in Bridgetown because we're also dealing with it in other spheres. And we see it as a matter that has to be dealt with both within the UNFCCC framework as well as outside of the UNFCCC framework. Because you are talking about the sums of money that have to go to paying for the losses and damages that are absolutely guaranteed to occur because we have failed to mitigate. And as we have failed to mitigate, adaptation gets more expensive, less effective, meaning even more losses and damages will occur. When you look at a country, for instance, like Dominica, in 2017, that was struck by Hurricane Maria. Hurricane Maria that incidentally was on its way to Barbados. And at the last minute, veered north and strengthened from a Category 1 hurricane to a Category 5 hurricane overnight and devastated Dominica. 226% of GDP lost in 5 hours. Let us think about that again. 226% of GDP in 5 hours. You do not recover from that on your own. You do not recover from that through the insurance. If you know that that is going to continue to happen, and the Caribbean, Latin America, and North American region are hit every single year, and that means the reinsurance goes up, the insurance premiums go up, and many of us cannot even afford the insurance that exists right now. So you know that insurance can't do it. You have to have a system that allows for countries to access grant financing if they are struck by an event. And let us say, for example, you lose 5% of GDP in an event. You should qualify. You are vulnerable. We're not in a vulnerability competition. If you are vulnerable, you should have access to those resources. And essentially, therefore, in a nutshell, Bridgetown is challenging persons, challenging countries to meet those requirements. And we're saying we were stalling and stagnating in the discussion. We're not saying that we're right on everything that we've done, but we're saying that these are options that we have put forward to stimulate the discussion and to move the needle. You're free to disagree with us. But when you disagree with us, if you disagree with us, then come with a solution that you can put on the table and let us talk and let us move the needle to address the seminal crisis of our times. And this is especially important for those of us like Barbados and many others between the tropics of Cancer and the tropics of Capricorn who are on the front lines of the climate crisis. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ricardo. That was very powerful and compelling. And I think you very clearly outlined the 3 areas: the need for mitigation investment, the need for concessional finance for adaptation, and the need for funds both inside and outside the UNFCCC for loss and damage. I'm now going to bring in Bodo Ellmers to maybe address that first and second piece, mainly about that concessional finance and sort of leaning on the debt infrastructure that we have right now to provide it.
Well, thank you. But let me start by congratulating Barbados for the simple fact that you came up with the Bridgetown Initiative. I mean, indeed, we might agree or disagree on the sense of nonsense of different policy proposals in the package, but indeed, it did spark a lot of debate about international financial architecture reforms, which is an extremely important thing in these days. And of course, it's also important that countries affected by climate change take on the role as policymakers, not as policy takers. And I think the initiative that Barbados took with the Bridgetown Initiative is a good example for that. Now, I'm supposed to give a verdict on the Bridgetown Initiative, which is quite a challenge because this is a bit like trying to hit a moving target. This reminds me that I once read a very entertaining philosophy book which had the title, "Every time I find the meaning of life, they change it." Looking at the Bridgetown Initiative is a bit like the same. Every time I'm done with my analysis of the Bridgetown Initiative, you come up with a modified or even completely new version. So this behind us is Bridgetown 2.0, which has just been released a couple of weeks ago, and it changed tremendously from the first version. But perhaps it's important to reflect on what the general objective of the Bridgetown Initiative measures is. I mean, I think it has been very much inspired by the situation we were seeing during the COVID-19 crisis, where rich countries could react with an enormous stimulus to the crisis. Rich countries mobilized within months $14 trillion to respond to the crisis. And they could do so at essentially zero interest rates. My own country, Germany, was borrowing more than $1 trillion at interest rates below zero. And you outlined that basically. I mean, countries of the global south had either no access to liquidity to finance at all, or when they got it at basically prohibitively high interest rates. Actually, if you want to put a little bit of a Marxist analytical lens of this, you can also say that capitalists who provide investment capital through financial markets discriminate negatively against countries of the global south. They expect a much higher rate of return when they lend to the global south, and in consequence, of course, they extract much more value from these countries. And the consequences are dire. The consequences are you have continued impoverishment and underdevelopment of these countries. You have an enormous debt crisis in these countries because governments and countries of the global south borrowed expensive money a few years ago, and the borrowing that they're doing now is basically just to refinance the old loans. So basically they maneuvered themselves, or they got maneuvered into a debt trap. And of course, the consequence, very obvious now for climate finance, is that actually using market-based climate finance at the current terms in which it is available for countries of the global south is not possible, because you can basically not fund the measures you need at the terms you get the money for. So that's, I think, in my view, that the problem that the Bridgetown Initiative is trying to address. And it's doing it mainly by using the multilateral system, the multilateral institutions, and trying to squeeze out more concessional finance of these institutions. I mean, Bridgetown 1 was very clear. There were 3 pillars: get more liquidity from the IMF, get more development finance from the World Bank, and set up Global Mitigation Trust Fund, which was supposed to be funded through new SDR allocations. I like that part actually a lot. Unfortunately, you dropped it in Bridgetown 2, because I like the idea of working with new SDR allocation, new allocation of special drawing rights. That is the type of money that the IMF can create. This was extremely innovative. So interestingly, you mentioned the word grant financing several times in your presentation. The problem is there were no grants in these proposals. It was all debt. And in my view, I mean, Bridgetown is coming a little bit too late for many countries, because many developing countries have already reached so high debt levels that even concessional lending is no longer within the limits of their debt sustainability capacity. So, I mean, Bridgetown is providing, the policy package of Bridgetown is providing money at more affordable terms than market finance, but of course not grants. It's basically all loans. And that's the thing. I mean, it's better than the market finance, but it's worse than grant-based financial transfers or taxes. Now, I was happy to see when Bridgetown 2.0 came up that there's a new chapter now on restoring debt sustainability, which is a good innovation, because here for the first time we talk about the situation that actually many countries cannot take on more debt to finance climate change-related measures or whatever, but actually you have to reduce the debt levels in these countries. Honestly, however, I mean, when I look at the points under this headline of restore debt sustainability, I find it a bit disappointing. I mean, it's mainly building on the common framework of the G20. The common framework is well, it's not even a debt relief initiative because it didn't relieve any debt so far, but it has been produced to address the debt problems of low-income countries, and it has concluded one case that was Chad in 2 years. Chad didn't receive any debt relief at all, and the other countries, I think at the moment we have 3 more in the pipeline, are basically stuck in a negotiation process for 2 years already. So the main idea is of the points here is basically to expand the common framework to middle-income countries, which I find is a bit weird, to be honest, because I mean it didn't work in low-income countries. So why would you expand it to other countries? I leave some more points because I think I'm running out of time to the colleagues to address. But perhaps, on the questions. I mean, is Bridgetown good for? I mean, fit for climate justice was our main question. I think this was probably not the main purpose of it. I mean, it was not necessarily a climate finance instrument. It was a larger financial instrument to address the financial needs of the global South. So I think we also shouldn't see it like that. I mean, for climate finance, of course. I mean, there are existing commitments, but the policy measures that the Bridgetown Initiative is presenting are, of course, I mean, a middle way, a better alternative to market-based finance. And perhaps last point, because it seems to be an evolving process anyway, how you work with the Bridgetown Initiative. So as soon as you start working on Bridgetown 3.0, perhaps you could take over some of the existing proposals we have on debt architecture reforms, because basically just in the same week as this Bridgetown 2.0 came up, the UN Secretary General released a policy brief in which, for instance, there were ideas about creating a global debt authority. There were ideas to create a multilateral legal framework for sovereign debt restructurings to make sure that developing countries can restructure their debt and enforce all creditors' participation. So it's no news. I mean, the policy proposals are there. And I think a new version of the Bridgetown Initiative could benefit a lot from incorporating these ideas. Thank you.
Thank you, Bodo, for outlining some of the other considerations and maybe where Bridgetown fits within the broader scope of multilateral development bank reform. I'm now going to move on to Emilia Reyes to consider some of the other elements of the international financial architecture. Bridgetown, in this iteration for the very first time, mentioned trade. There are other elements of it that relate to other components. There was a mention of taxation for loss and damage. So we're looking forward to hearing from Emilia on this.
Oh, yeah, there it is. So thank you so much, and thank you for being here with us, and for the amazing panels and all of you here, despite all of us being exhausted and the uncertainty of there is an agenda agreed or not, all of these rumors during the day. So thank you so much for being here despite that. I just wanted to follow on a point that Bodo was making. Maybe in the new upgraded version, we will get other elements to really make a package that is strong, that it works for the world and also for the islands. Given a data that in 2020, the Jubilee group came up with saying that if the IMF would sell less than 7% of its reserve in gold, it would be enough to cancel the debt owed by 73 of the poorest countries in the world for the next, I don't know how many years, let me see, until the end of 2021, and still leave the Washington-based organization with 26 billion more gold than it held at the start of the year. So the money is there, and there is really a problem with the way the global financial architecture is structured, as you rightly mentioned, and it's not taking into consideration not only those countries that were formed after the confirmation of these bodies, but really about the well-being of people and the planet. So there is a real need to challenge politically the powers that are there upholding the destruction of the planet as we know it at the moment. And just wanted to say how we all very much admire the leadership of Mia Mottley, and we really want to see her thrive and lead for this very powerful challenge that she threw last year, and hopefully she can also bring up other flags to complement the agenda that she's portraying. And let me say that I'm very much enthusiastic about her exceptional way to characterize the colonial order in which we're living at the moment, right? And I think because that is the core of the matter. For instance, in the agenda of illicit financial flows, which is kind of difficult to track and monitor, and there are many figures out there, but illicit financial flows are basically corporate tax abuse. A company in the global south is misinvoicing and reporting that the revenues were captured somewhere else. It's mainly in the tax havens in which they are reporting, and mainly they're located in the global north. So let me just give you one figure. In the past 5 years, $8 trillion went from the global south to the global north in the form of illicit financial flows. $8 trillion in 5 years. And we can go historically to that. And added to Bodo's point also on illegitimate debt and all the surcharges, etc., we have a huge amount of financial flows that are effectively leaving our countries. And some also moderate estimation says that in terms of international cooperation, for $1 that comes down to the global south on ODA, official development assistance, $8 leave the global south in terms of illicit financial flows. So we still need to have the rounded figure on debt servicing and other elements like the exploitation and the subvalue of the labor of our workers, etc. So there are so many components that needed to be matched there. And to Bodo's point, strengthening the global financial architecture is more than just using single instruments, because we understand that an agenda of instruments such as SDRs, etc., it's important to lay a path, but if we really need to address the current challenges, we need to think big about how really to reform the global financial architecture. So starting with the debt workout mechanism, or in the case of illicit financial flows, to support the discussion that is happening in the UN at the moment on a UN tax convention that was just approved precisely by the strength of the Africa group, and is a support of developing countries and a very hard resistance that they are meeting by developed countries in the UN. So we are going to see the next episode of this telenovela in September in the General Assembly. But these are the type of alliances that we need to build, because when we're calling for climate finance, what is that? Is to shifting the way in which we understand the financial flows and the priority of profit over the well-being of people and the planet. And this is happening elsewhere and not happening in the UNFCCC. And as rightly is doing, Mia Mottley is trying to shift this to other spaces. So what are the solutions? And I also wanted to highlight something that we rarely notice here in the climate space, the alienation with the CBD, with the Biodiversity Convention. And let me just tell you again, we know by the reports of science that we know this data already. Developed countries are responsible of 92% of emissions, of the carbon emissions, 92. But the other data that we need to know here is that developed countries are responsible for the extraction of resources in the world. 72% of the global extraction of resources is done by developed countries for their own consumption. 50% of those resources being extracted are extracted in the global south. So they're literally destroying the biodiversity in the global south. And now the trends that are telling us to fulfill their global Green New Deals in the global north, all of you colleagues in the global north calling for the global New Deals, the costing of that process estimates that by 2050, you will need 9 planets to deliver on the global Green New Deals of the global north. Because what we're doing is just expanding the energy base, but the global north is not reducing its consumption on energy. It's actually enlarging it. So they have fossil fuels plus the energy generated by the renewables. So this is why it's so important to make a connection that when we're talking about Paris measures, we're actually breaking the boundaries of the biodiversity convention. And so maybe we won't die of climate change, but we'll certainly will by the destruction of all of the ecosystems. So, and this takes me back to finance, because we have a target of $200 billion in the biodiversity convention. The financial flows going to fulfill the Paris Agreement in the global north are specifically and directly undermining whatever efforts are done in the Biodiversity Convention. And it's directly because there is not a shift on economic system, and we need to call out the global north and NGOs in the global north calling for a global Green New Deal without really understanding what it is, the economic system that that is happening. So we are calling for degrowth in the global north, post-extractivism in the global south, which are different paradigms. So how does that relate to trade, which is at the core of the matter, right? Because the extraction happened through dynamics of trade. That is the WTO. And again, there is a primacy of decision-making of the global north countries as opposed to those of us in the south who are entitled to defend our resources and to manage them. I mean, the African country is really struggling with just accessing electricity, and the WTO is coming and say, please sell us your rare minerals because the global north needs them to implement their global Green New Deal, so that all of you here will have your electric cars, your solar energy, all of your infrastructure at the expense on the livelihoods in the global south. So these are the things that we need to consider. So trade, tax, debt, there are so many elements that we need to discuss further. So not to question Bridgetown itself, but maybe to know that if there are powerful voices leading a revolution, as we would like, or let us say the reforms that we really need, we would really be supporting, alongside a package of instruments, a larger reconfiguration of the way the global financial architecture is set, because otherwise we say we are in an emergency, but what we have is not enough, and we really need to shift very quickly. Thank you.
Thank you, Emilia, for taking us 100 kilometers up and thinking about the big picture that we need to locate all of our conversations in, actually. And you mentioned the staggering scale of flows, and this sort of leads us to the next topic, which is very, very present in these rooms over the last 2 weeks, is the conversation on loss and damage. And the Bridgetown has proposed some mechanisms for raising finance for loss and damage. And Tetet, Lauron is going to take us through a sort of discussion about the needs for loss and damage and how Bridgetown addresses some of those.
Thank you very much, Gaya. And initially, when I heard Ricardo say that in the Bridgetown Initiative, there's not much going into the details of loss and damage, I felt sad because I was hoping that, you know, the Bridgetown Initiative would really try to present some concrete proposals on loss and damage, because we do know that the loss and damage era is already upon us, with overwhelming impacts on developing countries, communities, and population groups, especially in the global south. And loss and damage dramatically multiplies the economic and social crisis in societies that are already struggling with multiple injustices. No, and I think most of us in the room are somehow loss and damage experts overnight, because we do know that countries that have accumulated their wealth on the backs of the poor countries continue to refuse to foot the bill. You know, that's why financing is always a sticky issue in the climate negotiations. And I'm also glad that a lot of our loss and damage colleagues are here in full force. Some of them presenting absolute, wonderful research to provide us with a lot more evidence to make our case. For instance, we do know that major climate and weather events in developing countries last year alone cost more than $109 billion in losses. Losses, which means it can't be recovered, no, it's gone forever. But this amount does not yet take into account smaller events that have devastated, for instance, a local community, or slow onset impacts, or non-economic loss and damages. So if we talk about the real amount or the real cost of loss and damage, 109 billion is peanuts. Because we do know that it's far greater than that. And the estimates are actually somewhere in between 425 billion US dollars in 2020 to 671 billion in 2030. So any discussion on loss and damage finance, and I'm hoping that Bridgetown version 3.0 would consider this, should use $400 billion a year as a floor, while acknowledging that the figure would have to be revised upward over time. Non-economic loss and damage, usually it's devastating and hard to put a price tag on, but it needs to be evaluated nonetheless because resources, finances are needed to address these. And of course, some climate impacts hit immediately and cause loss and damage instantly, while slow onset processes cause loss and damage over time. So these are some of the things that we feel are not detailed enough, in the Bridgetown Initiative 2.0. And more importantly, I think some of the questions that we have on where the money should come from. You mentioned already, that the loss and damage finance should be provided in line with the basic principles of the Convention and Paris Agreement around equity, historical responsibility. Funding should be new, additional, predictable, precautionary, and adequate. But more importantly, it should be needs-based and guided by the best available science. So far, what we have seen here in the negotiations is that climate finance pledges, and I'm not even talking about, actual pledges that have turned into contributions themselves, have largely been mitigation-centric, not reaching the communities, and mostly in the form of loans. So they are all woefully inadequate. And developed countries that have consistently failed to undertake mitigation actions while gaining super profits from fossil fuel pollution, their economic activities have emitted. That, for instance, the U.S. fair share of loss and damage finance would be in the vicinity of $20 billion US dollars in 2022, and this would increase to $117 billion by 2030. France, who is hosting next week's Super Summit, actually owes 2 billion euros a year in loss and damage financing. And this would increase to 5.22 billion euros every year by 2030. So they really have to, walk the talk and pay up. But in order to raise the scale of finance necessary, there's been discussions around alternative sources of finance that meet the principles of transformative climate finance. So, a lot of these proposals around fossil fuel profits, carbon damage, financial transactions tax. I'm not seeing that elaborated in the Bridgetown Initiative, apart from seeing a lot of, nice, better terms for developing countries to avail of more loans, for their financing needs. And I think we should really be clear that funding mobilized through instruments that seek to profit from the climate crisis and create greater fiscal burden for developing countries should not be considered. So we're talking here about private finance flows, insurance premiums, etc., etc. So now going to version 2.0, and I think this is where we could have an interesting conversation. It calls for an integrated development and resilience initiative to achieve SDGs. You put forward some proposals to address the different issues of concern to many developing countries, including calling for a reform of global economic governance. Those are all good. Now, those are all good, but these are issues that are already, hopefully, to be addressed in the FFD forum. So maybe we could think about what value addition, the Bridgetown Initiative could make to the FFD process happening in 2 years' time. You already mentioned that loss and damage is not so prominent in the Bridgetown Initiative, but looking at some of the elements, there's debt suspension for 2 to 3 years, which is already discussed even in the IMF World Bank spring meetings, no? The natural disaster and pandemic clause. So it's all good, but consistent that it's there. What I find concerning is there's mention about loans, lending instruments during natural disasters. I feel that, no matter how much concessional the terms are, this would still be loans that would have to be repaid without even considering why developing countries need to take out loans in the first place and why developing countries are so much in debt despite decades, I'm overreacting, despite decades of structural adjustment programs that supposedly aim to bring them out of the debt trap. Now, so some of the fundamental questions around debt have not really been expounded on as much. And it is also unclear to me whether the natural disasters mentioned in the version 2.0 is, sudden onset or also including slow onset and also including non-economic loss and damage. I'm not quite happy with the $100 billion a year mention around new international sources for the loss and damage fund. We keep stressing here as civil society, it needs to be needs-based and guided by the best available science. So I'm just worried that we could be Copenhagened into accepting this 100, that's a new term. We could be Copenhagen into accepting, a random figure drawn out of thin air. So my last comment would be around the private sector instruments of 1.5 trillion for green and just transformations, just to caution everyone that, when you talk about private sector instruments, their profit motivation, their accountability to their shareholders comes into real tension with delivering global public goods. So I'm hoping that it's not just going to be about loans, but really about, funding that would make a difference for people and planet. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Tetet, and I can confirm that you're never overreacting, so you're just right on target there. So now what we're going to do is we're going to move to a regional perspective. We've got Adrián Martínez from La Ruta del Clima to discuss what the specific challenges are in the Latin America region and how this proposal relates to those.
Thank you, and thank you everyone for their participation and you for being here so late in the day and so late in the conference. You're very committed. I think one of the first thing that I perceive when I see the Bridgetown Initiative is going back to who has to pay. And Article 9.1 of the Paris Agreement says developed countries shall provide financial resources to developing countries for adaptation and mitigation. So when me as a Latin American person hear countries here at the UNFCCC discussing new ways for us, the developing countries that were supposed to receive financial resources, means to get loans, means to reform the financial structures, to get the resources that were supposed to be provided by developed countries as agreed in the Paris Agreement, then I'm thinking, are we reconceptualizing who has the responsibility to pay for the implementation of the Paris Agreement? And that is a very key question. are we opening conceptually the question on who was meant to pay? Because financially, and I'm a lawyer, I'm a human rights activist, I'm not a financial specialist. When I see this, they seem very rational things to do. I would hope that when the Bretton Woods institution came to my countries, and when I hear reform, I immediately think adjustments and think all the damage that the financial system and the Bretton Woods institution did to Latin America. I would have hoped that they would have thought all of these nice things about developing and loans instead of crashing us into debt and misery as they have done for the last decades. And that is something that did not happen. So when I see this, the first thing I think, are we reconceptualizing who has to pay? And then there's something that Galeano, an author from Latin America, says, that underdevelopment is not a stage, it's a consequence of the system. And the Bretton Woods institutions are not unfit for purpose. They have done exactly what they're meant to do for decades. They have destroyed, exploited, made us subservient to the global north economic needs. That's why my region, my country, is an export. That is why we import 70% of our food, even though we're completely capable of producing 100% of it. That is why we conceded to give the United Fruit Company almost half our country to provide you with bananas for the last 100 years. And that's why copper, coal, oil, and now lithium is going to flow back to the developed countries to provide for whatever needs you have. So then again, when I see this, I very question, should we entrust the same institutions that for the past decades and since they were born, were created, have destroyed us to solve a climate crisis that we know by agreement that we're not supposed to pay? Are we so concerned about mitigating the little carbon footprint that my region has that I'm going to entrust again the World Bank to lead me out of this crisis when I'm supposed to be the one that is the creditor from the global north for their destruction, for the abuse, and I think for their abuse of the per capita carbon budget that is there. Those are billions of dollars that they have used, and now we are also supposed to get a loan. So it's a cycle, and we have seen it in the past, and I think history and memory is subversive because it makes us think that the structures that are there, if they're not questioned, they will last forever. And it is not my destiny as Latin Americans to be the provider for the global north. It is not my destiny to find ways to continue on with a crisis that I'm not supposed to pay and that I did not enjoy creating it. And this is something that I think we're ignoring, that this cycle of crisis and reforming the financial system is not the first time that we have seen it in Latin America. It has come many times before of how to do a smart reconstruction, smart reforming through loans. Each time there's a crisis, the economic system of the global north comes and offers us loans. And then what do we need to do? Provide a way to get their coin. And then what we do, we sell the resources, the lithium that is in South America that you guys want. And that is not the way I feel that we should perceive and imagine our future, especially when Article 9.1 says that the global north, are the ones that's supposed to pay. So I would hope that the Bridgetown Initiative would have happened 50 years ago, before my country and my region was forced to have 78 million people in poverty, before the 37% of all the Latin Americans live in poverty. But it in fact did not happen because the economic system is fit for purpose, it's fit for oppression. So I would ask you to reconsider, is 9.1 of the Paris Agreement still relevant, or are we switching reconceptualizing who has to pay? Thank you.
Thank you, Adrián. And I'd like to invite Ricardo. Ricardo, I know all of us have immense respect for Mia Mottley and the work that your office has done to put forward these solutions at a time when there was very little discussion on these issues, and you've really propelled them to the front. And I think that's why this healthy debate and conversation and iterations, and I can see there's been multiple references to Bridgetown 3.0, so we're looking forward to working with you on that. But I just wanted to give you 5 minutes to reflect on some of the things you've heard today and maybe give us some insight into what might be next for Bridgetown.
Thank you very much. And thank you very much to all of my colleagues on the panel for their very insightful comments. There are a few matters that I wanted to speak to specifically to what was said. I think everybody here has the concerns of the Global South absolutely at heart. And one of the interesting things is that as we have developed Bridgetown, we have seen some of the changes that we have proposed taken on board. And so if you see some of the things move off, it is not that we're not continuing to push them, but it is because we've already gotten a response so far. So for instance, on the issue of the SDRs, we've already seen SDRs be utilized under the IMF RST, Resilience and Sustainability Trust. And we've had the approval of countries under the RST for access so far already, including Barbados, Costa Rica, and Rwanda. We've also seen SDRs being made available to other institutions outside of the IMF to date. So for instance, the IDB have gotten access, CAF, amongst others of that ilk. And so we've been seeing that sort of response and change going forward. The issue of losses and damages are being addressed right now by the Transitional Committee. And Professor Passad, who is the primary architect, no matter how much other assistance he may have had from others on that, is also a part of that committee. And so I think part of it is that we want to give that committee an opportunity to do some of the critical work that it has to do to be able to move us on. We have always seen the issue of slow onset events as critical as those of rapid catastrophic events. And so, for instance, again, if you can prove that, say, for example, you have lost 5% or more of your GDP as a result of an event. And it's easy to do because we all collect GDP information, whether or not it is the best metric. It is a metric that we have all agreed to use so far. So if you can prove that, you should get access to a loss and damage fund. In addition to that, the issue of non-economic valuation is one that we have struggled on. And our view is, let us deal with the economic valuation matters first and prove that we can even get the financing for that and understand that we plan to address the issue of non-economic valuation as well. But right now, we have absolutely nothing, which brings us to the NCQG. And I see a few of my colleagues in the room smiling at me from both developed and developing countries. And the reality is the NCQG is trying to set a new finance goal. We know that our needs are in the trillions of dollars. We also know that we have failed to deliver the 100 billion promised. Those are realities. And so I think part of it is in the pragmatism of my Prime Minister understanding that as much as we know we're not responsible for the circumstance, and as much as we know that Annex II countries should be stepping forward to take more of a share of the burden, we fear that if we do not act here and now, that we will simply die waiting. And that is a major concern that we have to face up to, because for those of us in the developing world, being left to die and to wait is something that we know only too well about, unfortunately. And so we see the need to act right now, even understanding that, as my grandmother always used to say, that whenever I said, but that is not fair, my grandmother said, it is an unfair world with a lot of unfair people living in it. That is a reality that, as chilling as it sounds, is one that we have to face up to. The issue of mitigation done in the global south can actually have benefits, not just for the planet, but for us in the global south. We need to move on a green transition, especially in the energy sector, not just to cut down on emissions, but to save us the foreign exchange that we need so critically. Because right now, the majority of us are dependent on oil and gas that we have to pay for in foreign currency. And that bleeds our economies dry. It also leaves us absolutely dependent on the vagaries of the price of oil and gas internationally. I have colleagues who are in the room with me from Barbados who can tell you what we have gone through as we have addressed the issues of fluctuating prices of oil and gas, changing the price of every single thing within the country. Finally, just to speak on the issue of MDBs and IFIs in the Latin American and Caribbean region. There is no region in the world that is more dependent on MDBs and IFIs for financing development than Latin America and the Caribbean. The vast majority of us have been graduated. The vast majority of us have high debt to GDP ratios, but we are seen in many instances as middle and indeed in some cases high income countries. We have to be able to get access to the financing that allows us to continue the development of our people and to continue to address the SDG-related matters that we all have on our front burners. I want to thank everybody here for coming, for showing your interest, and for continuing to work with us on Bridgetown, whether it is 2.0 or 3.0, because it can only grow and we can only move the needle if we're willing to have the hard discussions as we've had on this panel, where you take your criticisms, you take suggestions, and you evaluate, and you amend, and you change, and you go forward. There are going to be other changes that are going to come as a result of what we hear next week, as a result of meetings with the G7, with the G20, and with the V20, which we are very active members of. We need to address the issues effectively, and we need to go forward collectively. And I'm glad for the comments that have been made here, especially in the presence of my NCQG colleagues, as we fight to set that new goal and understanding that the NCQG cannot be all things to all people, like Bridgetown cannot be all things to all people. So we need to set the parameters, we need to set the boundaries, and we need to work collectively to get us to where we need to go, not just from a climate finance perspective, but from a development and survival of humanity and the countries that exist on this planet collectively in a world that the Bretton Woods institutions were not built for. Thank you.
Many, many thanks, Ricardo. And I think we're with you every step of the way, and this is a collective endeavor, and we're all here to work towards a common purpose. So we appreciate your wise and generous contributions to the panel. We now have a few minutes for questions from the floor. I think there's a roving microphone, so please do just wave your hand around, and I think we have one over there.
Hi there, thank you so much for this. I'm David Hillman from Stamp Out Poverty. I just want to say that I've been working on loss and damage, and it's really important to applaud Prime Minister Motley's contributions at Glasgow and in Sharm for being strident and really asking for a fund to be won there, and civil society and all the country groups really worked together, and a breakthrough happened. So I think it's really important to mark that. But of course, where we are now is that we've won the bucket, but we haven't won the money. And right here and right now, we're facing this massive problem about how to move finance forward on all fronts, on mitigation, adaptation, and loss and damage. I wanted just to say that the ambition shown by the Bridgetown Initiative, there's lots of disagreements, but I think everyone agrees that it's been so necessary to open up space to talk about the role of the IFIs and to talk about the additional climate finance that's needed. And so I think it's really important that in Bridgetown, loss and damage is seen as grants-based finance. And where there's definite division is that under adaptation, that is seen under Bridgetown as concessional, maybe very low-cost concessional finance over a long period of time, but it's still seen as debt. And given the debt distress that Bodo very well articulated, that is seen as a big challenge for civil society. But I do think that the space under innovative finance, which is going to be for additional sources, like taxing carbon, like making the polluters pay, taxing the financial transaction tax has come back up under this. So next week there'll be working group 4, and that's chaired by Professor Prasad, that the person you referred to. It would be very interesting to look at that space and see whether new money can be drawn in. But let's have no illusions. Ultimately, this is public money, additional public money that needs to be drawn in at scale that is required to fill that pot for loss and damage. I'd be very glad for the panel's ideas and responses to that.
Thank you. I think we'll take a couple and then let people respond.
Thank you. Gadir Lavadens, global coordinator of the Global Campaign to Demand Climate Justice. I want to share the following with you. So it says, Italy helped a retailer open chocolate and gelato stores across Asia. The United States offered a loan for a coastal hotel expansion in Haiti. Belgium backed the film La Tierra Roja, a love story set in the Argentine rainforest. And Japan is financing a new coal plant in Bangladesh and an airport expansion in Egypt. And you may wonder, what does it have to do with it? It's because all these projects are claimed to be climate finance, and they account for 2.6 billion. So using the expertise this great panel has on finance, I wonder if you could elaborate on, and if the Bridgetown Initiative, or how do we deal with this issue? Just for curiosity, thank you.
Are there any more questions? If not, then maybe we can move to, so the first question was basically about additional finance and flow and sources of finance and the need for this new money to be public finance. And then we had a question about where is this finance going, essentially? Right within the remit of the Bridgetown Initiative, but there might be some thoughts here about how we ensure that climate finance actually goes to the right places. Maybe I'll just let everybody have a sort of minute each, and if you don't want your minute, you can pass it to somebody else, and we can start in reverse order. And Adrián.
So I'll answer the funny question. I think we have to be careful where the money goes, but honestly, let's also be careful where the money comes from. And hopefully it doesn't come from the pocket of the Global South. Thank you.
Well, I actually want to invite a woman to ask a question or to submit a comment. Yes, in the back. Sorry, I'm going to give my space for a woman.
Thank you so much for that. Hi, my name is Joanna Kleva. I work with One Campaign in Berlin. I was just wondering whether someone from the panel could give some ideas of what to expect from next week's meetings in Paris, and maybe what not, or what hopefully won't happen, and whether there is anything that you would like for the civil space to also, make loud and clear before everyone reconvenes in Paris next week. Thank you so much.
I will say that I'm certainly not going to put my neck on the line and say what's going to happen in Paris next week. I think there will be a few very interesting announcements, certainly, though. And what has been very interesting is the amount of activity that is going to be going along on the sidelines in Paris. I think part of the fear that we have is that there is so much activity that we're hoping it does not detract from the wider issue. But the first comment that was made relative to public funds and that need, I would like to be able to get that recording to play at the next meeting of the NCQG. I think you more than eloquently made the point that I have spent the last 2 days trying to make, but I'm certainly happy that there are a few colleagues in the room who are part of the NCQG process, including one on the panel here and now that I will not identify, who know well the battle that is going on in that respect. But you're very, very right. There are lots of different pots of financing, and we need to ensure that we identify what is happening in each of those pots and where those things are important. And to say that for us, there's no doubt that grant financing is critical and important. And we have been pushing on the increase of grant financing and opportunities for grant financing, but they're not nearly as much as they need to be. And it is very difficult, especially for small, middle-income countries, to be able to attract that financing and to push for more of it. We have accessed quite a bit of financing through the GCF, but it is an extremely onerous process with an institution that was put in place to be nimble and to operate quickly. And that is just my position on backflipping through macaroni elbows. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And we have another question.
Hi, my name is Anne from the Women and Gender constituency. That has been a really, really interesting discussion. I mean, interesting is the wrong translation of intéressante in French, but anyways, I think one element is missing in this discussion is what about gender justice? When we talk about climate justice, climate finance, where is the feminist aspect of that? And where is then the feminist dimension in the Bridgetown Initiative? So I'd be interested to hear some answers on that from all panelists, if they can. Thank you.
I mean, I don't know about the gender analysis of Bridgetown. I just want to say two things. We're not discussing the Macron summit because we think that is a distraction. We don't think Bridgetown is a distraction. We think actually it's an initiative coming from the Global South. So it's really worth engaging about if there's a dream coming from the Global South, how are we envisioning our dream from Global South? In that sense, also, we are wondering just about the effects of Bridgetown may have in the UNFCCC within the G77. I mean, so what is the configuration politically internally? We are very interested to see moving forward. But for us, the Macron summit is again another diversion and illegitimate space of power, such as the G77, the G7 and the G20. Those are illegitimate spaces of power composed of just wealth, and they think that they can decide for the rest of the world just because they have wealth. And so we think we need to go back to the United Nations, where is this one seat, one vote, especially the poorest countries and the smallest countries that have the most affected. And as Adrián was saying, they're subsidizing the wealth of the world. And I would say again, this is our feminist and decolonial view. Women are also subsidizing the economy of the world, as well as indigenous peoples are subsidizing the entire biodiversity. We are breathing out of landed air because of thanks to the indigenous peoples upholding 80% of the biodiversity. Those are the main subsidies. So we need to see how the global financial architecture accounts for those. And just want to say the problem also with talking about concessional finance, etc., and the notion of climate finance in our critical analysis, not in these formal spaces, but in our critical analysis, again, we need to talk about the finance that works for people and the planet. So it cannot be only finance if it's climate finance, if it's destroying biodiversity. You get me? We cannot just keep on talking about climate finance without bearing in mind the planetary boundaries. And this is a very real concern for people that are not necessarily under UNFCCC. We need to think big, we need to challenge our paradigms, and we need to leave our bubbles. So this is what I would like to say for the moment.
Yeah, perhaps also to pick up a couple of strands of the discussions that have been taken forward in the last 30 minutes. I mean, first, yeah, indeed. I mean, a good thing about the Bridgetown Initiative, it's mainly public financing options, but of course, it's also mainly public lending options, which I find is a bit worrying. We discussed this already, that grant-based finance is needed. Taxes appear for the first time in the new version, the term taxes, in the context of the loss and damage financing, which I don't know if it's such a good idea to have necessarily earmarked resources, earmarked taxes for a loss and damage fund. But just to make clear, I mean, for us, I'm also part of the tax justice movement. It's extremely important when we talk about taxes that it's progressive taxation, because not all environmental taxes, I mean, it's mostly about carbon taxes, and that they're not all progressive. Two things that the civil society community, of course, advocated for is the excess profit tax on fossil fuel companies, but also the wealth taxes, because, of course, emissions are very clearly related to wealth. So this is, I think, two strands to develop this tax part of the Bridgetown agenda forward. Then on multilateral institutions, I mean, you said that SDRs have been taken off the agenda because they had been realized through the IMF, Resilience Sustainability Trust. I mean, first, I think the idea of the original Bridgetown agenda to have new allocations of SDRs has not been realized. And secondly, I find it was a very worrying development that the IMF started to become a climate financier. I mean, we looked at the first programs and we actually found green conditionality in these programs. We found conditionality like lowering import tariffs for electric vehicles or liberating the renewable energy and deregulating the renewable energy market. So we found the same neoliberal policies now with a green touch to them, basically, which is when you compare what which countries are doing. I mean, when you look at what the Americans are doing, for instance, with their so-called Inflation Reduction Act, they're giving a lot of subsidies to develop homegrown solutions and homegrown industries in the green sector. So I'm not sure it was a good idea to strengthen the IMF as a climate financier and everyone who negotiates here to how to move forward with climate financing. So please do not use the IMF channel, use other channels. That's also said, and then I just want to endorse also what Emilia said on how to move the policy process forward. I think what I said in the very beginning, it was great to see the Bridgetown Initiative come up by a country of the global south. So now don't give it to the French, don't give it to Macron, basically, which is again giving it back to a country of the global north. And also, and indeed, I mean, the G7 and the G20 are not the forums to take this forward. The legitimate forums to discuss about the implementation of governance reform, global economic governance reforms, about mobilizing finance for development and climate finance are the United Nations spaces. Thank you.
Just to quickly respond, I think at the end of the day, whether we like to deal with them or not, they exist. And we have to treat to them. We need to find a way to more effectively and more fairly treat the issues. And just to address the issue of gender, I think what you will find as you look around, you will find countries in the global south where women are in crisis. You will find where men are in crisis, where the youth are in crisis, where the aged are in crisis, because some of us have aging populations, and those challenges are very real. We have issues with persons with disabilities and access and so forth, and those are in crisis. But the reality comes to it is that the global south in totality is in crisis. We're drowning under a debt in which we have gone from the colonized spaces that have made the global north rich to being the spaces that are indebted, and in paying our debts, we continue to make the global north rich. And what it means is that for us, every single man, woman, and child matters in the global south, and we are drowning. We are absolutely drowning. And what we are looking for is the opportunity to move the needle for our benefit on these matters. I think we have a responsibility to address issues of gender, to address issues of ageism, to address issues of access for people with needs. But I don't think that what we want to do is to in any way water down what is our collective call as a people to have our voices heard, to have our financing needs met, especially to respond to a crisis that is not of our making. But if we sit and we wait for those who have made the crisis to finance us out of it, I can guarantee you that every single year going forward at this UNFCCC process, we will see the number of countries reduced because some of us will simply not be here to participate. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I want to extend a huge thanks to the government of Barbados and to Ricardo and to all our, Adrián.
Just one comment, and just to close, justice is radical. It's a radical demand in this space, and one thing that I don't like is double thinking. And we know it's unjust. We know that it doesn't work. We know the system is against. It has structurally created this situation, and we still engage with the system. We can always break the system. We can also not pay the debt. That has to be also on the table, because we know that it's structurally unjust, and we know that the developed countries are not fulfilling their obligations. So all options have to be on the table. Thank you.
Thank you so much to all of our panelists, and I hope we can continue this conversation in the FFD forum and around the UN Tax Convention and all the other positive developments that have happened in the last year and back here at the UNFCCC. Thank you, everyone online, everyone here. I hope you have a restful weekend after 2 weeks. And just let's give another round of applause to our wonderful panelists before we close. Thank you.